Let me start with I'm not a big fan of the term virtual power plants for a couple of reasons. One, there's nothing virtual about it. The outcomes that we see are very real and very valuable. And I think the power plant framing is incorrect. It's a very different type of asset. So because the moment you start comparing these assets to a power plant, you're going to lose in a sense, because it's an incorrect framing. You're trying to solve very different problems, right? It's like comparing your car at home with an 18-wheeler on the road, right? It's just different. Just because they both transport doesn't make them comparable.
Well, if you are following along with us, most of the conversations that we have here on SunCast and at our Power Up Live stage in person at the trade shows throughout the industry are with industry participants. I've long wanted to have more conversations around how things are perceived and progressing at the utility level. Every year we at least try to get one person from the utility to give us some time. This year, Tilak Subrahmanian, Vice President at Eversource, is taking some time to talk a bit about the integration of all of these resources into the overarching machine that is the utility, and how that process is evolving. As I mentioned, we're live here in Boston at the RE Plus Northeast show. Power Up Live stage is brought to you by Conductor Solar, Encore Renewable Energy, and Solar Simplified. Tilak, welcome to SunCast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I look forward to this conversation. I've been thinking about it, and I feel that we potentially could go in a lot of different directions. You know, at stake is, how do we think about integrating renewables and distributed energy resources, DERMS, as the term goes. But I imagine there are other terminologies that either are sort of in favor or out of favor. I want to start with one that, for me, sort of in the solar industry, represents a term that we are rather affectionate with and affiliated with. And I want you to define it, and then I feel like we're going to have to explore a little bit what it means at the utility level. But could you explain what virtual power plants are as a product?
Sure. Let me start with I'm not a big fan of the term virtual power plants. For a couple of reasons. One, there's nothing virtual about it, right? The outcomes that we see are very real and very valuable. And I think the power plant framing is incorrect. It's a very different type of asset. So because the moment you start comparing these assets to a power plant, you're going to lose in a sense, because it's an incorrect framing. You're trying to solve very different problems, right? It's like comparing your car at home with an 18-wheeler on the road, right? It's just different. Just because they both transport doesn't make them comparable, right?
Yes.
So prefer terms which are less catchy but boring, probably better descriptive. Demand flexibility, demand management, those are the kind of terms we prefer to use internally. And what we're trying to do there is, you've got all these assets. And again, I know there's a lot of conversations out there in the industry about, the conversations in the energy industry tend to be binary. Either all of this or none of it, right?
Yeah.
And what way we think about it is, these have a role to play just as investment in infrastructure does.
Yeah.
And it's not either or, it's how do you integrate the two and get the best bang for the buck.
Give me the term again. That's the alternative for a virtual power plant.
Let's go with demand management or demand flexibility.
Demand flexibility. And what sort of assets typically fall into the category of demand flexibility from a utility perspective? What qualifies?
The way we think about it is, almost any asset that is on the customer side of the meter. Again, you could have assets that are on the grid side of the meter that are larger, distribution grid connected programs. But for the most part, you know, customers are putting in, obviously they have their homes, their buildings, you've got thermostats, you've got energy consuming devices there. You've got commercial and industrial customers who've got business operations, again, energy consuming. Then you've got things like battery storage that some folks may have. EVs can be energy consuming or dispatching.
Yeah.
So when we think about it, we're looking at that whole portfolio of assets and thinking through, one, what problem are we trying to solve? And how do we leverage these assets to solve them? So we have a program called the Connected Solutions Program that's very well known in the industry. But even that is, as successful as it is, we see a lot more opportunities to do more with connected solutions. But what we are solving there today is wholesale system level triggers.
Yeah.
But we just see a lot of triggers as in something that might be the reason why you call an event.
Yes.
Case in point, July 16th, 2024, it was a very, very humid, muggy day, high humidity, about mid-90s, but the combination, the heat index was high.
Yeah.
And we called it an event. We, as in 5 New England states, called it an event. It wasn't an ISO event, but we called it at the retail level. We got about 340 megawatts of demand shift, which is a lot. Eversource alone accounted for about 200 megawatts of that. That's a real asset. That has really happened. That's what I mean. It's not virtual, it's very real. But the way we brought that about is through the portfolio of assets we have connected. So we've got in our programs today about 70,000 residential customers.
Yes.
About 350, 400 commercial and industrial customers. And they have assets. It can be either a load reduction or a dispatch of battery.
Right.
That's what we use to achieve whatever outcomes we want.
So historically, when I bought my home in North Carolina, it came with a demand response sort of program attached to my HVAC unit. And it was one of those things where Duke Energy could have an event where they would effectively control my HVAC, reduce the load from that HVAC, because I guess for the uninitiated, what's happening essentially is on these hot days, there isn't enough predicted energy supply to service the demand that the heat would suggest is going to come onto the grid. So as a utility, you're trying to you want to have purview of and control over those assets, these distributed energy assets. And what we historically think about is energy efficiency, right? The ability to curb a load, to draw down on a load. How does the introduction then of generating assets or load shifting, battery storage assets, either make it more complex or maybe make it more complete for you as a utility to think through those distributed energy resources?
Yeah, so let's start with what kinds of problems are we trying to solve here, right? The example you described years ago, decades ago, it used to be very simple on-off, where if there is a grid condition where they don't have enough generation, it's a switch that turns off your AC. Today we have smart thermostats in homes connected that are, driving those. You can have much more sophisticated controls. You can do pre-cooling, so you're still maintaining customer comfort. And you can be very surgical about when and how you do that. You're going to have messages right on your smart thermostat that inform the customer. You can do all kinds of things. So that's one, the deployment of different kinds of technologies just gives you a lot more optionality than we had in the past.
Right.
The conditions that you might use, that then when I call them triggering events, like what are the reasons why you might call an event?
Yeah.
And there can be a few categories, right? So one category is just grid conditions, either at the distribution level or at the wholesale level. So the SCADA system sees, or the wholesale ISO sees that, hey, we are at generating limit. We're concerned that we may not be we don't have enough generation.
Right.
And they may call an event to reduce the load so we can have, demand meet generation. In the case that we just called the event, I mentioned on July of last year, that there was no constraint at the ISO level. So we were not trying to solve for that. What we were trying to solve for is two other things, is really more policy oriented. What we were trying to do is mitigate the risk of another peaker plant getting fired.
Right. So the cost of a peaker plant is higher.
The cost of the peaker plant is higher and more. And here in Massachusetts and New England, there's a lot of emphasis on GHG reduction. The peaker plants are usually single cycle turbines, have a high GHG output. That's what we were trying to mitigate. What we are also trying to mitigate there is the way the ISO calculates their installed capacity requirement, the calculus they go through to determine how much capacity they are going to procure. We were trying to influence that by reducing demand. So we were solving for a different thing. So that's what I mean is the whole assets historically, it was used in a very simple condition like you described to just mitigate, hey, if we don't have enough generation, let's reduce
loss avoidance,
But now it's much more complex. It can be grid conditions at the distribution level, generating conditions at the wholesale level, can be policy related, or what I call is, this is where I use the term demand management instead of response, because response suggests an event trigger.
Yep.
EVs would be a good example, right? We're trying to get ahead of the problem. So a typical single family home might pull 3 or 4 kilowatts peak.
Yeah.
When we got our EV a few years back, the EV alone was pulling 12 kilowatts.
Right.
And then 10 of my neighbors got it, right? So the distribution grid is not designed to handle that. But guess what? I don't need to be charging at that rate, because as long as the car is ready in the morning, I'm indifferent. So what we are doing is these managed charging programs. We're using the same assets, but it's a different framing, different problem we are trying to solve, right? We're trying to reduce the rate of charge.
I have 2 questions that come to mind as I'm thinking about the complexity involved. And this is not, so Eversource is one of numerous utilities and co-ops that have to think through the demand management and the flexibility of these assets. One, where does the responsibility lie in terms of determining how these assets are managed, sort of at the utility level or private company level? And then I guess the second is, how do you see the software component evolving? Because it seems to me like the decision, the calculus, it's the algorithm to decide, okay, we have a GHG target, we have a cost implication and a carbon intensity implication of a peaker plant coming on, and we have to decide which assets we're going to turn on and off, which are we going to call storage, are we going to call for a reduction? How are these decisions being made at a software level? How has that evolved in the time that you've been in?
So let's unpack that a bit. The policy questions dimension to your question is really, that's the policymakers in the state determine that, right? The policy office of the administration, Massachusetts, that's the DOER. So those are the folks who, the Clean Peak Standard was something that was passed by the legislature. All of that comes from there. I think what we as utilities do is, we are the boots on the ground that really have a lens into how customers use energy.
Yeah.
So we bring that perspective and insight to help inform how these higher level policies get organized, deployed. We go to the Department of Public Utilities, that's the economic regulator, right? That's then with a proposal, and they either give a thumbs up or thumbs down or a tweak. So that's how that process works. To your other question on how we are actually thinking about all this and dispatching it at the software level, there is, again, these are all things in development, because we are spending a lot of time thinking about the integration of grid-side investments and customer-side investments to achieve the policy outcomes that New England has, Massachusetts has. So from a software architecture standpoint, if you will, even pull that up at system level architecture, we think of what we are working towards is, we have a grid DERMS, which is closed coupled with our SCADA system. So at any given time, we need to know what is the topology of the grid, what is the power flow, so that there's the reliability is always maintained. They may call for an event, because based on grid conditions, that's one of the use cases we talked about, right? And so what we're doing is developing a lot of those use cases, and then what we call the edge DERMS or customer DERMS, whatever term you want.
So grid would be like generation, distributed energy?
So the grid DERMS, what we call, is really managing, keeping close coupled contact with the SCADA, not so much generation, but large front of the meter assets. So if you have a large front of the meter battery, we've got a battery system on Provincetown that can carry Provincetown for 4 hours.
Wow,
Right? So at peak. So that's the kind of asset that you might dispatch directly from the grid.
Typically larger assets.
Larger assets. They're also coming real-time conditions of the grid and, power flow.
And they're incentivized differently.
But what's happened is, if they say, hey, we need some demand relief on these feeders in this section, we have the edge DERMS, which is going to have all of the contracts and knowledge to say, I need to dispatch these customers and these assets over here in order to satisfy that need. So that's how we're thinking about it, and there's a lot of reasons why we would want to separate the two, from cybersecurity reasons and so forth. But the edge DERM, the customer DERMS, is really where we are using it to manage the customer contracts, where you might have a variety of different reasons why you dispatch. Once you determine what is the value exchange with the customer, all of that is embedded in the customer terms or edge terms.
Yeah.
So that's how we are thinking in terms of where is the logic and where is what is done where. And then there's a whole governance system internally around making sure we're all talking to each other that we have stood up. And that's, to be honest, that's as much a cultural change
Yes.
as anything.
I think it's fascinating as well, the number of times policy has come up as the driving factor that, we've explored a lot on the podcast as well, the reality that it is policy almost in its entirety that's driving many of the decisions around our energy infrastructure, because the policy helps determine the thing that you've brought up a couple of times. What are we solving for? What's the question that we're trying to answer? I wonder on the sort of who is responsible for this aspect of it. I'll mention the company's name. The one that comes to mind is Renew Home, right? So you mentioned smart thermostats. Companies are increasingly taking, I'll call it ownership of, you got Sunrun and Sonova on the solar plus storage side. You've got Renew Home on the Google Nest thermostat side.
Yeah.
You've got increasingly companies that sort of own, operate, and manage these DERMs. How do you as a utility think about those private actors and their role in the overall utility experience for your customer?
The short answer is they are allies, partners, and assets.
Yes.
So and this is what I mean. The edge DERMs or customer DERMs that we are putting in place.
Yep.
That is what we use to send a signal to Renew Home saying, hey, we need some relief.
Yeah.
They are the ones going and sending the signal to the thermostats in your home. We are not directly sending a signal to your thermostat.
Yeah.
So our signal goes out to Renew Home, it goes out to Ecobee. If we want to do some managed charging with EVs, we are sending it the EV OEM. It used to be we go through the chargers,
point
and so forth.
Now it's
but
going
now
to the OEMs.
we're going through the telematics in the car.
Okay.
Right? So we are not directly,
Yeah.
it's cloud-to-cloud integration. So Sunrun, so we see those folks as allies and partners in this, and that's what I meant. Our edge DERMs is really focused on managing those relationships.
Right.
The grid DERMs is keeping track of the grid, and then the two will talk, and we have a whole governance around making sure we're not screwing anything up.
Yeah. So the current administration's stated mission around energy is unleashing our American energy infrastructure. How do you see grid and edge DERMs playing into that narrative as the energy matrix certainly seems to, well, as it is under the microscope right now?
Yeah, to be candid, I'm not clairvoyant enough to tell you what's going on at the federal level.
Sure.
For better or for worse, the United States has never had a federal energy policy, right? We are very driven by state policies.
Yes.
Probably what's the biggest driver here in Massachusetts is the climate legislation that Massachusetts passed in 2021 that's driving a lot of these. Connecticut and other states around here have very similar goals, even if they haven't leaned in as hard.
Yeah.
That's driving, local activity. There's no question that federal policies have an impact, particularly around large-scale generation, offshore wind and stuff like that. So, but that's, you got generation, you got transmission and distribution, and then you have end-use decarbonization. Where I play, where DERs play, where VPPs, if you want to use that term, play is under that end-use demand flexibility. Thank you. End-use decarbonization.
Yeah.
We've got a whole portfolio of investments around the grid and making sure it can handle the level of electrification we are talking about. All of that comes under state purview.
And I'll tie it back to this administration because something that is becoming more and more clear to me, and I hope that this administration really embraces it. And I'll tie it back to something that perhaps was, depending on what circle you're in, was very popular or unpopular, but Roe v. Wade was increasingly presented as bringing the decision back to the states, right? So we have an administration who is very proud of the fact that they are now empowering the states. It's not a federal decision, it's a state decision. Well, that's a great thing because it turns out our energy policy is almost never a federal policy. It is a state-level driven policy game, and those state policy decisions are different throughout our wonderful union, right? I wonder, as someone who's active day to day in thinking about grid and edge DERMs, What is the utopian version of the future integration of these assets for you from the utility perspective, or maybe just from your professional opinion?
Look, the more I dig into this, we got into a lot of this in Massachusetts because for policy reasons.
Yeah.
Massachusetts and Connecticut and other New England states, for instance, have invested heavily in baseline energy efficiency.
Right.
That Massachusetts started with the Green Communities Act in 2008.
Yeah.
In the last 12, 15 years, the energy reductions we've achieved in Massachusetts, that's 15 terawatt hours.
Yeah.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
That is, to put it in perspective, that is the annual output of 5 of the last Mystic unit that was shut down here.
Yeah.
Right? Big numbers. My point being, these may get started or initially pushed by policies, but at some point, economics takes over. So there is a compelling economics around energy efficiency.
Yes.
So when I look at all these assets, DER assets, and I've talked to many colleagues in supposedly red states, you'd be surprised how nuanced the conversation is. There is a lot of understanding of these assets are there. It'll be silly if we don't leverage them.
Yes.
And obviously the grid conditions and what problem they're solving for is going to be unique to each area.
Yeah.
But I think there's a broad recognition that these are assets that are out there. We ought to make the best use of it. And it'd be silly not to.
Yeah. I think that if, at Main Street, not Wall Street, the prevailing question that any homeowner or business owner is going to ask is, that's all well and good. Eversource and Renew Home and Sunrun and Sonova and all these companies have these assets, and they're playing their game of moving electrons around. Does this demand flexibility actually, at the end of the day, lead to lower energy costs?
That's the premise we hope, right? And I'll give you a couple of examples of that I'm not going to suggest that it's an easy answer. We have to work at it. Yeah. And there's a lot of complexity there because the energy system is very, very complex. You can't reduce it to sound bites and press releases. Right. Let me give you a very specific example of small businesses, something that we did a few years ago. We went and looked, we've done quite a bit of work looking at demand profiles, developing demand personas, if you will, of different customers. And when we did one for a fast food chain, breakfast chain, and you would think their load profile would be, starts early in the morning, 4 or 5 a.m., by 10 or 11 a.m. they're done.
Yeah.
You would think that's their business profile, by the way.
Yes.
The peak hours are 5, 6 a.m. to probably mid to late morning. Sure. And then they still have businesses very small.
Yep.
You look at their load profile, you would have never guessed that.
But are they a bakery?
They are more than a bakery.
Sure.
Among that.
But I imagine the low profile suggests they're doing other activity when they're not serving consumers.
So here's my counter to that. We looked at their load profile and compared it to their point of sale data.
Yes.
And they were not doing a whole lot of business during those other hours. I mean, there was modest business during them.
Sure.
But it turns out when you go to a lot of these areas, you remember they have those toasters, the electric toaster?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, several of those toasters, but they were not selling any toaster products.
Yes.
The big innovation there is turn the darn things off.
Ah.
Right? My point is that directly went into the economics of that small business.
Yes. Yes.
So again, very simple, very limited. We don't need fancy artificial intelligence algorithms to figure that out. Right? It's common sense.
Yes.
But my point is, there is so much opportunity to do things like that and drive it to scale. Almost any, and that's what we do. That's the expertise we bring. Is you go to a place like this, a hall like this. What is the energy use? What is the use when there isn't a conference going on? How do you mitigate that? How do you work with the owners of this to mitigate that? Right? There's a ton of opportunity there. We can bring down costs, but you got to get into it. It's complex. It's nuanced. So you can't reduce it to sound bites.
Yep. Well, you said the word reduce. And I was going to say that, it's just like recycling. The way that this works in energy as well is reduce first and foremost. And I think that the biggest energy opportunity under our noses that most people forget is energy efficiency. And it is the biggest block of opportunity around demand flexibility is how can we be more efficient with the electrons that we're generating? I wonder, as a last thought, are there any regulatory changes needed to support the growth of this demand flexibility?
I would think so. Look, when I came into the energy industry, I came in accidentally, and it was here in Massachusetts where we've always had very, very supportive, might I say, even encouraging regulatory frameworks and things. I mean, there's always nits, but so I do think regulatory frameworks have a big part to play. I think some of that is a bit push and pull, right? I don't think regulators always, they don't have the benefit of being boots on the ground to understand what the opportunity is. Last summer, I had the opportunity to go to Denmark as part of a U.S. delegation. We had commissioners from around the country. Just a sidebar, Denmark is the size of Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And they're similar climate zone. Their GDP is about a little smaller than Massachusetts. A lot of interesting comparisons and what they're doing. My point is, as we were walking through with my colleagues, meeting officials, visiting customers there, I was pointing to a number of things they were, saying, hey, we've already done that in Massachusetts.
Right.
And so since then I've had calls from some of them saying, hey, how did you guys set it up? And these are the regulators in the different jurisdictions. So I think some of it is just a missing awareness, and I think we'll get there. I'm very bullish. As I talk through peers, and whether it's in the utilities or outside utilities with regulators around the country, it's just much more of a common sense discussion. I think there's a lack of awareness around some of these opportunities that I think is increasing. So I'm very bullish about all this.
Tilak, for folks who want to learn more about sort of the philosophy you guys are engendering at Eversource, or maybe interact in more specific way with Eversource or yourself, how would you recommend that they go about finding more?
Well, certainly look up our Connected Solutions program and what's working there. Reach out to us. And we're happy to share. I've had several folks here today wanting to understand what we're doing. We don't have all the answers, but we have a few, and we have thought through, and we'd love to hear if somebody else is doing something we haven't thought of.
Yep. Well, you heard it here first. Virtual power plants. We're gonna try and retire that terminology. If certainly not the asset, but the terminology. Demand flexibility is in. Virtual power plants is out. You heard it first here on SunCast. Tilak, thank you for taking time.
Thank you. You're in the media business. You can make that happen.
From your busy day. We'll see. We're going to make a campaign around demand flexibility now.
All right.
Thank you, Tilak. Appreciate it.